He didn't cross the water for a woman. He crossed because Verity Cole carried the one cipher that could unmake his empire, and Ambrose Kroll had just taken her. 2 nights before the treaty meant to end a 20-year war, Emmerich Corvy's unshakable secretary vanished from a locked office. When he finally found her, deep in enemy territory in a room that reeked of rust and cold river water, what had been done to her didn't just shatter the truce, it made him break every rule he had ever lived by. The frost never fully cleared from the glass on the 51st floor. Even now, in the dead hour before midnight, Emmerich Corvey could see the harbor through it, a black sheet of water stitched with the frozen lights of his own freight terminals, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and let the cold press back through the pane into his palms. Cold kept a man sharp. Warmth was how you stopped noticing the knife going in. Behind him, a fire burned in a hearth that had never once been lit for its heat. It was there because the men he did business with expected a fire, the way they expected the aged Scotch and the level handshake and the smile that stopped at the teeth. "You're brooding at your own docks again," Lucan said from the low chair beside the chessboard. Emmerich's younger brother wore their father's easy grin like a borrowed coat that fit him a shade too well. He rolled a capture pawn across his knuckles, over and under, over and under. 2 nights, 2 nights and the accord is signed, and the Corvey name stops being a shape in every rifle scope across the river. You ought to be opening the good bottle, not glaring at the water like it owes you money. "The good bottle is for after the ink is dry," Emmerich said, and did not turn. The accord was not a peace he wanted. It was a peace he could survive, and somewhere in the last 20 years, he had stopped believing there was any other kind. The war with the families on the far bank had put his father in the ground, had carved a hand's width of scar down his own side, and had fed the harbor more bodies than the harbor cared to admit. The treaty would end it the only way anything ended in his trade, as a ledger entry. Ground for ground, silence for silence. He did not trust the men whose names would sit beside his on the page. He didn't need to. He needed only that they loved breathing as much as he did. "Verity has the final terms?" he asked. "Verity has everything," Lucan grinned. "Verity always has everything. I'm half convinced that woman keeps the devil's forwarding address in that little red book, filed under D." Emmerich almost smiled. His gaze dropped to the chessboard between the chairs, several moves into a game. His secretary was patiently, ruthlessly winning. His king stood jammed into the corner, walled behind its own men. Hers held the center of the board, unbothered, guarded on every side. That was the comfort of the world he'd built. Every piece had a square. Every square was accounted for. Nothing crossed the board that he did not watch cross it. He had no idea that one of his pieces had already been lifted clean off it. Verity Cole had kept the outer office for Emmerich Corvey for 5 years. And in 5 years, she had never once been late. She was not what visitors expected to find seated outside the door of the most dangerous man in Halden Bay. She was small and unshowily dressed, dark hair pinned back from a face that volunteered nothing, and she carried a stillness that unsettled loud men without her ever lifting her voice. She owned no gun. She owned a worn oxblood notebook, its spine gone soft as chamois from handling, and inside it, in a private shorthand only she could read, lived the whole nervous system of his empire. Routing numbers, the names of judges, which dock inspector took the envelope and which one took his coffee black, and repeated every word of it to the prosecutor's office. She distrusted screens. "A server can be copied in the dark, and you'd never feel it," she'd told him once. "Paper only burns, and I never let mine leave my reach." She knew the difference between his silences. She knew which of his men were skimming before the men knew it of themselves. When a far bank enforcer had once propped his boots on Emmerich's desk to make a point, Verity had set down a fresh cup, slid a coaster beneath it, and asked the man, courteously, to move his feet so she could reach the low drawer. He had moved them. She beat Emmerich at chess every Thursday, and had never once let him win to soften him. She was the quietest, steadiest thing in a violent life, and he had grown so used to her being there that he had stopped seeing her at all, the way you stop seeing the floor that holds you up. And at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, for the first time in 5 years, Verity Cole did not answer her phone. Emmerich called twice more. It rang out both times and then stopped ringing at all. The phone dead, or switched off, or carried somewhere his signal couldn't reach. She's asleep, Lucan offered. Even Verity has to sleep sometime. She doesn't switch her phone off. Not ever. Emmerich was already moving for the door. She keeps it face up on the nightstand, in case I need a name at 3 in the morning. For a man I mean to bury by 4. He crossed the corridor to the outer office, Lucan trailing him, and found the door to Verity's office, standing open. That alone was wrong. She locked it every night, a deadbolt she'd fitted herself, keyed to no one else alive. Now it hung ajar. The frame beside the lock burst inward, raw pale wood showing under the paint like bone through a split lip. Inside, the room was immaculate, the way she always left it, except for 2 things. Her chair lay tipped on its side across the carpet, and in the dead center of her spotless desk, squared to the edges the way she squared everything she touched, sat the oxblood notebook. She never left the notebook. She would sooner have left a hand behind on a blotter. Emmerich crossed the room and lifted it. 1 page had been marked. The corner folded down hard, though she never dog-eared a page in her life. She used thin silk ribbons. He opened to it and found her shorthand gone. Across her neat columns, in a looping stranger's hand, 4 words had been written: she was always ours. The cold that went through him, then owed nothing to the harbor. He knew that hand. He had seen it once before, 20 years ago, on a card pinned to his father's coat, when they lifted the old man dripping out of the black water. Below these very windows, Ambrose Kroll wrote his threats by hand. He believed it lent them a certain grace. Lucan had lost all the ease in his voice. He was reading the 4 words over his brother's shoulder, his face gone the color of ash. What does that mean? Always ours. You don't think she wouldn't, would she? And there it was. The thought slid into Emmerich clean, the way a good blade always goes. Painless until you shift your weight and feel it grind on bone. She was always ours. 5 years of Verity holding every account, every name, and every soft seam in his armor, all of it handed to her gladly, because she was the one person he had never once had to watch. Where better for a rival to bury a knife than inside the hand that pours your coffee? She had not been taken, the thought whispered. She had finally gone home, and she had carried 20 years of his secrets out the door, on her way. He stood in her ruined office with her notebook crushed in his fist and made himself believe it, because believing she had sold him hurt considerably less than the alternative, that she was loyal, and that she had been dragged screaming into the dark just outside his own door, while he stood at a window haggling over treaty clauses. Bring the car around, Emmerich said quietly. If she sold us, we don't chase her ourselves. We send men. We keep our hands clean. Bring the car, Lucan. He closed the notebook over his thumb. Because the burst door frame told a different story than the 4 black words did, and some cold, exact part of him. The part Verity herself had spent 5 years sharpening, had already caught the contradiction and would not set it down. People who walk out under their own power do not get their own door kicked in. I'm not sending anyone. I'm going myself, and whichever it turns out to be, she can say it to my face. The bridge across the river marked the edge of everything Emmerich Horvey was permitted to do. For 20 years, it had been a line drawn in funerals. His people on the north bank, the Kroll families on the south, and between them the Black Channel, and a single understanding paid for in bodies. You do not cross, not for money, not for blood, not for anything. In 2 nights, the accord would make that line lawful and permanent, a border with his own signature beneath it, and here he sat at 1 in the morning, telling his driver to run straight over it. Boss. Anselm Rowe had held the wheel of Emeric's car since the two of them were 19 and reckless, and he was neither of those things now. He kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the frost-blind road. But Emmerich could hear the whole argument the man was choking down. You cross tonight. There's no accord. There's no clean version of it. One Corvi car on the South Bank, and the war we've spent 20 years trying to end starts again at dawn over a secretary. Then don't let anyone see the car. Emmerich watched the iced girders slide past the glass, the water below the flat gray of a gun barrel. Drive Anselm. The tires bit onto the far bank, and something in his chest went quiet and certain and cold, the way it always did once he decided to do a thing that could not be undone. He should have seen it coming. That was what kept turning over in him as the ruined south side unspooled past the windows. Shuttered canneries, black windows, street lamps, shot dark for privacy. He kept circling the last 2 weeks, and finding all the warnings he had, walked straight past. Verity going still in the middle of a sentence when a truck backfired in the street below. Verity, asking him 3 days ago, offhand, never looking up from the notebook, what he would do if he ever learned that someone close to him had lied about who they were. I'd bury them, he'd said, not lifting his eyes from the draft, and she'd answered, of course you would, and turned the page, and he had not thought of it again. He thought of it now. He thought of the bruise on her wrist last week, the one she'd tucked back beneath her cuff before he could ask. He had been so busy buying peace that he'd failed to notice the woman who kept the piece running was quietly coming apart in front of him. Where am I headed? Anselm asked. You still haven't said. The South Side's 40 square miles of people who'd shoot us for the plates alone. Kroll never keeps anything worth having where his soldiers can reach it. Emmerich opened the oxblood notebook on his knee and tilted it to the passing light. He was not reading her shorthand. He was reading everything around the stranger's 4 words. The bite of the pen, the faint ghost of a second impression, pressed through from a page torn out beneath. Verity had taught him this without ever meaning to. Every time she'd laid a document in front of him and said, look at what they didn't want you to read. But my careful girl left me something anyway. Beneath Ambrose Kroll's 4 words, pressed into the paper hard enough to scar the sheet under it, ran a single line of Verity's own shorthand, written fast, in the dark, by a woman who knew exactly whose hands her notebook was about to fall into, and who had gambled that only one man alive could read what she left behind. 3 marks. A number. The name of a saint. St. Cyprian's, Emmerich said, softly. The old sailmaker's chapel on Pier 12. Kroll bought the whole block through a shell 4 years back and let it rot. Nothing there worth guarding. He shut the notebook, which is precisely why he'd guard it. Anselm was quiet a moment. She drew you a map. While they were dragging her out, she drew me a map. Something moved in Emmerich's throat that he had no name for and did not want one. So I'm going to go and collect her, and if she betrayed me, she can explain it on the drive home. And if she didn't. He stopped. The far end of that sentence was a country he hadn't set foot in for 20 years, and he wasn't ready to now. Kill the lights. We walk from here. They left the car 3 blocks out, in the shadow of a collapsed loading crane, and covered the rest on foot through snow gone gray with salt and ash. The cold on the south side was a living thing. It found the seams of Emmerich's coat and lay against the old scar down his ribs like a flat, patient hand. Cyprian's rose at the end of the pier, a brick hulk with a half-fallen steeple, its windows boarded, the cross above the door hanging inverted where a bracket had rusted through. It should have looked abandoned. It didn't. 2 cars sat out front, with their engines running, to keep the men inside them warm. A cigarette flared orange behind one windshield. On the second floor, behind a sheet of boarding, a thin blade of electric light leaked through a gap in the wood. Men do not sit in the cold guarding nothing. Light does not burn on the upper floor of a dead chapel for no one. Emeric drew the pistol from under his coat, and the metal was so cold it felt wet in his palm. He had crossed the bridge, he had broken the line his father had died drawing. There was no version of the next hour where he walked any of it back. 2 in the cars, he murmured. God alone knows how many inside. We are so far past every rule I own, Anselm, that I can't see them behind us anymore. Anselm racked the slide on his own weapon and breathed a long plume of white into the dark. Then let's stop counting them, he said, and go and get her. The men in the cars never had the chance to be surprised. And Merrick came out of the dark on the driver's side of the first sedan and put 2 muffled rounds through the glass before the man behind the wheel had finished turning his head. Anselm took the second car with the same flat economy, a wet cough of sound the wind swallowed whole. Then the pier was silent again, but for the 2 idling engines and the slap of the channel against the pylons. And Emeric was moving for the chapel door with his heartbeat slow and enormous in his ears. The side door gave at his shoulder. Inside, the cold smelled of rust and river water, and, beneath that, something coppery and human that made the animal part of his brain go very still. A single work lamp burned somewhere overhead, throwing the gutted nave into long shadows, the pews long since taken for firewood, the floor a waste of pigeon filth and broken glass, a stair climbing the far wall to a choir loft where that blade of light showed. He went up with his back to the wall. At the top, a door. Behind it, 2 bored voices complaining about the cold, and beneath them, ragged but stubborn, a third sound he would have known anywhere. Breathing. Hurt breathing, drawn carefully around what had to be cracked ribs, but even controlled. The breathing of a woman refusing, out of pure spite, to give the men in that room the satisfaction of a worse sound. Emeric opened the door and stopped being a man who signed treaties. The 2 Kroll soldiers barely cleared their holsters. He put them both down before they could bring their guns up, not killing, not yet, because some cold planning corner of him had already decided he would have questions, and crossed the room through the noise and the dropping bodies to the chair standing in the center of the light. Verity was bound to it. They had tied her wrists to the arms of the chair, and she'd been straining against them long enough to rub the skin raw. Her left eye was swollen shut, the socket a deep, spreading violet. Her lip was split, her face gray and drawn with cold and exhaustion. Whatever Kroll's men had done to make her talk, she had plainly given them nothing. She wore the wrung-out, unbreakable look of a woman who had been questioned for hours and simply refused to answer. Her dark hair hung loose across her battered face. And beneath all of it, when she lifted her head at the sound of the door and found him with her one good eye, her cracked mouth pulled sideways into something that was almost unforgivably a smile. "You're late," Verity rasped. Her voice was wreckage. "You're never late." Emeric went down on his knees in the filth in front of the chair. For most of his life, he had watched men die without his pulse shifting. He had ordered it, caused it, slept soundly after. And the sight of Verity Cole bound to a chair in a freezing chapel, hurt and refusing to stop smiling at him, struck him somewhere beneath all of that. In a room he had bricked over so long ago, he'd forgotten there was anything left behind the wall. "Who did this?" he said. It did not come out as a question. It came out flat and final, a sentence already handed down. "Doesn't matter." She was watching his hands work at the knots, watching them shake, and something flickered across her battered face. Surprise, he realized. She was surprised his hands were shaking. "Emeric, listen to me. Before your conscience catches up to you and you do something loud." She swallowed, and it visibly cost her. "They didn't take me to get at you. I don't care why they took you. You will." Her one eye held his, glassed with pain, but knife-sharp beneath it. The sharpness that had run his empire for 5 years, cutting clean through the fog. "They took me for what I am. And you're about to find out you never actually knew?" Emmerich worked the last knot loose from her wrist and caught her hand before it could fall. Her fingers were ice. Behind him, one of the men he'd put down was dragging himself toward a fallen pistol. Anselm, up the stairs now and at his back, set a boot on the weapon, and the man went still. "Then tell me," Emmerich said. "Quickly, what are you?" Verity looked at him a long moment, and he watched her decide to hand over the one thing she had kept from him for 5 years, the way a person sets down a weight they've carried so long they've forgotten how to stand upright without it. "Cole was never my name." Her voice was raw, but it steadied as she spoke, sliding into the flat, exact register she used when she was telling him something he could not afford to hear wrong. "I was born into the Kroll house. Ambrose took me in when my parents died, running his money, raised me at his own table, called me his goddaughter, and the year I turned 16, he learned I could read a ledger faster than any grown man he owned, so he made me his cryptographer. Every coded account he holds, every buried name, every dollar he's sunk in 30 years. I built the cipher that hides. All of it. It doesn't exist without me. He can't so much as read his own empire without the key that lives in my head." Emmerich went very still. The chapel was silent, but for the wind and the wet breathing of the wounded man on the floor. "4 years ago he had my sister killed," Verity went on, and now her voice did waver. Once, before she nailed it flat again. "Nessa. She'd seen something she wasn't meant to. He called it keeping the books tidy. So I took the only thing that would ever make him bleed. I carried the key out of his house inside my own skull, and I ran, and I found the single place on earth. Ambrose Kroll would never think to look for me. Inside his enemy's fortress, pouring his enemy's coffee, running his enemy's whole empire so cleanly that no one would ever think to ask where I'd come from." "You hid from him," Emmerich said slowly, "by hiding inside me. I chose you." She held his eye. "I could have run anywhere on earth. I stayed 5 years because you were the one wall in this city he couldn't climb, and because somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd year, keeping you standing stopped being cover and started being the point." She looked away, as if she'd said more than she'd meant to. "I never sold you a thing, Emmerich. I gave you the best 5 years your organization has ever had, and I asked for nothing, because the day you learned what I was, I knew you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now." He did not know how he was looking at her. He only knew that the betrayal he'd carried across the bridge, the clean, bearable version of the night, had just died in his hands, and that what stood in its place had no floor beneath it. "Then how?" he said, and his voice had gone quiet and terrible. "Did he find you? 5 years, and he walks into my building the one week I'm looking the other way, and lifts you out of a locked office." Somebody drew him a map. Her good eye met his, and he saw she'd arrived there hours ago, alone, in the dark. "Yes," she whispered. "Somebody did. Somebody who knew I never switch my phone off. Somebody who knew which door I lock." She swallowed. "The rot isn't across the river, Emmerich. It's in your house. It was always going to be someone you'd never think to watch." Her mouth twisted, bitter. "You never do learn to guard the pieces sitting closest to your own hand." The wounded man on the floor laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "She's not wrong," he slurred, his breath coming ragged. He was older than the other one, a lieutenant by the rings on his fingers, and he had the loose tongue of a man who'd already decided he was dying and wanted company for the walk. "We didn't hunt her for 5 years, Corvey. We got a phone call. Tuesday night. Somebody in your own tower rang the boss himself and said, 'She'll be alone tonight. The door locks from the inside, and the little bird you've been missing has been living in Corvy's cage the whole time.'" He grinned red. "You want to know who sold her. Look at whoever you'd trust to hold your coat." Anselm cut Emmerich a glance. "Is this true?" And Emmerich didn't answer, because a name had already surfaced in him, cold and whole, and he was busy forcing it back under. Not yet. Not without proof. A man who acted on the first name the Dark handed him was a man who could be steered, and Emeric Corvey did not permit himself to be steered. "How many more coming?" Emeric said to the lieutenant. "Enough." The man's grin widened. "You crossed the river for her. You think the boss doesn't keep eyes on his own chapel?" They radioed the second your car touched the bridge. "There's no treaty now, Corvey. You started the war back up all by yourself tonight, and you did it for a woman who isn't even who she told you she was." Outside, faint but rising, came the sound Emeric had been waiting for. Engines. More than two. Headlights swept across the boarded windows, throwing long bars of light down the ruined nave. This was the moment, and he understood it with perfect clarity even as it arrived. There was still a version of the night, where he walked out the side door alone, drove back over the bridge, signed the accord in 36 hours, and let Ambrose Kroll keep the woman who had lied to him for 5 years. It would cost him nothing but her. It was, by every rule he had ever lived by, the correct move. Cut the liability, protect the peace, guard the empire. Emeric looked at Verity, at the raw marks the ropes had left on her wrists, at everything Kroll's men had done to try to break her, at the fact that she had endured all of it and left him a map, in her own shorthand, rather than give them the one thing that would have made it stop, and he set the correct move down and walked away from it forever. "Anselm, get the cars outside running," and pointed at the bridge. He crouched and slid an arm behind her knees and one behind her back. "We're taking her home. There's a dozen of them, boss. Maybe more. Then we don't stop moving." He lifted her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. It made him want to burn the whole south side down to the waterline. As he turned for the stairs, the lieutenant called after them, still laughing. "You'll never make the bridge, Corvey." Emeric paused at the top of the stairs and looked back once, and whatever was in his face put an end to the man's laughing. "I've broken every rule I own tonight already," Emeric said. "Do you understand what that means? It means there is nothing left holding my hand. Tell Ambrose Kroll, the treaty is dead, his chapel is mine, and the accountant he spent 5 years hunting is under my protection now." He shifted Verity higher against his chest, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, since before his father went into the river, since before he taught himself to turn to ice to survive, something roared up in Emeric Corvey that was fully, savagely alive. "And tell him if he wants her, he can come to the North Bank and ask me himself." He carried her down into the dark and the gunfire, and he was not afraid, and he was not cold, and some buried part of him that he'd put to sleep 20 years ago was awake again and would not be lying back down. The nave became a shooting gallery. They came in through the front doors. 4, then more behind them, and the muzzle flashes strobed the ruined chapel, white and black and white again. Emeric went down the last of the stairs with Verity pressed to his chest and his whole body curled around hers, and Anselm stepped past him into the open and became, for 11 seconds, the most frightening thing in Halden Bay. He did not hurry, he never did. He put men down in the order they'd come through the door, 1 and 2 and 3, walking Emeric and his burden toward the side exit with his own body for a wall. "Car boss. The near one, keys are in it." Anselm's voice was almost bored, the way it got when the alternative was panic. A round chewed brick from the wall an inch above his head, and he didn't flinch. "Go. I'm behind you. I have always been behind you." Emeric hit the side door with his shoulder, carried her through the freezing dark to the nearer of the 2 idling sedans, and laid her across the back seat as gently as the gunfire allowed. "Stay down," he told her. "You didn't live through that room to catch a stray now." "Wasn't in my plans," she gritted, and folded herself into the footwell with the grim competence of a woman who had, he was beginning to understand, spent her entire life planning for the worst night of it. Then he was behind the wheel, and Anselm was throwing himself into the passenger seat, and the sedan was fishtailing off the pier, with 2 sets of headlights swinging into pursuit. The south side tore past, black, gray, gone. The bridge rose out of the dark, its girders furred with ice, And Emmerich drove at it the way he did everything once he'd decided. No brakes, no doubt, not one glance back. A pursuing car pulled level at the foot of the span. Anselm put his window down, let in a howl of freezing wind, and made the problem go away with 3 unhurried shots. The second car saw what became of the first and fell back, unwilling to follow a corvée onto the north bank now that the rules were ash. Because that was the thing they all understood. On both banks of the Black Channel, the instant Emmerich's tires touched the northern span, the line was broken. 20 years of terrible peace was over. And the man who had broken it was not running from the war he'd started. He was driving home to prepare for it. He did not take her to the tower. The tower had a traitor in it. Emmerich understood that, now the way he understood the weight of the gun beneath his coat. A fact of the body, not the mind. So he drove instead to a place that appeared on no deed, near his name. A narrow brick row house on the north edge of the freight yards. A safe house Verity herself had set up years before, and logged in no records but her own. She gave him the address from the footwell in a voice thinning toward shock, and he understood, turning onto the dark street, that she had built him an escape route out of his own organization, long before she'd had any reason to think he'd need one from the people inside it. She had been guarding him against his own house for years. He simply hadn't known which war she was fighting. Dr. Rena Locke met them at the door in a coat thrown over pajamas, roused by a call Anselm had made from the bridge. She took one look at Verity and stopped being sleepy. On the table now, Locke had patched corvée. Men in worse rooms than this one, and she wasted nothing, not motion, not words. She cut away the ruined blouse, and Emmerich made himself watch, made himself see all of it, every mark Kroll's men had left, because looking away felt like one more way he had failed to look at her for 5 years. 2 cracked ribs, maybe 3. Locke's hands moved as she talked. The bruising is ugly, but nothing's broken that won't mend. None of it meant to kill, all of it meant to make her talk. The wrists are raw where she fought the ropes. She's hypothermic and running on empty. She glanced up. When did she last eat, Emmerich, or sleep? Look at her. This isn't one bad night. This is a woman who's been braced for the roof to come down for a very long time. The words landed somewhere under his ribs, and stayed. He thought of 5 years of catered lunches he'd expensed without once wondering whether she ate. 5 years of her handing him coffee, flawless, on time, while she carried a dead sister and a hunting god and a code that could end an empire, alone, in the quietest office on the 51st floor. He had built his entire life on noticing what other men missed. He had missed her completely. "Fix what you can," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Whatever she needs. If it's blood, take mine." Locke's eyebrows rose a fraction. Emmerich Corvée did not open a vein for anyone, but she only nodded and got to work. Verity, half conscious under the doctor's hands, turned her head and found him across the room, and something moved through her battered face that he would spend the next hour trying to name. She had spent 5 years certain that the day he learned the truth was the day he'd feed her to the wolves. Instead, he was standing in her safe house offering her his blood, and she plainly had no idea what to do with that at all. She lasted perhaps 90 minutes before she tried to get off the table. Emmerich came back from the front room, where Anselm was posting the 2 men they could still trust at the doors, to find Verity sitting up, gray-faced, one hand braced on her taped ribs, the other reaching for the oxblood notebook he'd carried out of the tower and set on the sideboard. "Absolutely not," he said. "He's going to move the money." She didn't stop reaching. "The moment Kroll hears his chapel's gone, and I'm not in it, he knows the key walked out on 2 legs. He'll start shifting every hidden account he owns before dawn. And once it's running through enough shells, I lose the thread and the one weapon we have on him is gone." Her fingers closed on the notebook. "I need a laptop and I need it now. This is the window, Emmerich. It's open for hours, not days. You have 3 broken ribs. Then help me sit up straight. It pulls less. She looked at him, and under the exhaustion, the old dry steel was back, the thing that had run his empire without ever once raising its voice. You didn't cross the river to save a woman who lies on a table while the only shot at Kroll closes. You crossed it to save me. So let me be me. He looked at her a long moment. Then he pulled the chair to the table, eased her upright, with a hand flat between her shoulder blades, set the laptop in front of her, and put a glass of water and 2 of Locke's pills where her hand would find them. 1 hour, he said. Then you rest, and that isn't a negotiation. It's the rent on the laptop. The ghost of a smile. You're learning to bargain. I taught you that. You taught me most things. He watched her fingers find the keys, and steady watched. 5 years of fever-quick competence pour back into her ruined hands. Lines of code scrolled. She pulled a file from a server that lived nowhere he could name, and the screen filled with a lattice of numbers that meant nothing to him and everything to her. There, her voice dropped, gone soft with a terrible satisfaction. 30 years of Ambrose Kroll, and he handed the map of all of it to a 16-year-old, because he was certain she'd never have the spine to run. She began, delicately, to take it apart. Every account, every judge he owns. Everybody he's paid to vanish with the invoice attached. Emmerich, I can't just hurt him with this. I can erase him. I can hand the federal prosecutors a wrapped gift and let the law do to Ambrose Kroll what your father's whole war never could. Emmerich stood behind her chair, hands on its high back, close enough to feel the fever heat still rising off her, and understood that the quiet woman who had poured his coffee for 5 years was holding the most dangerous object in the city in her broken hands, and that she had chosen out of every option in the world to hold it inside his house. You could have used this the day you arrived, he said quietly, walked into a prosecutor's office, burned him down, and been free 5 years ago. Why didn't you? Her hands went still on the keys. Because the day I burn him, she said, not turning around, is the day I stop being the girl he raised and become whatever survived him. And I wasn't ready to find out what I'd be on the other side of that, she resumed typing. I think I'm ready now. She worked until her hands stopped obeying her, and then Emmerich closed the laptop over her objection and made her lie back against the pillows Locke had stacked, and for a while the safe house was quiet. The tick of the radiator, the low murmur of Anselm's men at the doors, the wind off the freight yards. He thought she'd gone under again. He was wrong. He usually was. About her name was Nessa, Verity said into the dark, apropos of nothing, her eyes on the water-stained ceiling. My sister. I haven't let myself say it out loud in 5 years. She was quiet a moment. She was the loud one, the brave one. Everyone always took me for the careful sister, and her for the reckless one. But she's the one who told me to run. That last night, she said, you're the only one who can read what he built, so you're the only one who can end him. So, live and end him. Then she went back inside to buy me the 10 minutes, and I took them, and I've spent 5 years not knowing whether that made me the coward or the weapon she wanted me to be. Emmerich sat down on the edge of the bed. He did not reach for her. He'd learned, in the space of 1 day, that Verity gave more when she wasn't being reached for. My father played chess with me on Sunday nights, he said, after a while. Terribly. He was a brilliant, frightening man, and a genuinely awful chess player, because he could never stand to lose a piece. He'd give up the whole game before he'd spend a single pawn. I used to think it was a flaw. He turned his scarred hands over in the lamplight. The night they pulled him out of the river, I understood it wasn't. He knew every man on his board, by name. He knew their wives. He couldn't spend them, so he couldn't win. So eventually a man who could spend people put him in the water. His jaw tightened. I swore I'd never make his mistake. I learned to spend the pawns. I got very, very good at it. And somewhere in there, I decided the safest thing a man could do was make certain he never loved a single piece enough to hesitate over it. And how? Verity asked softly. Did that work out for you? I crossed a river tonight, Emmerich said. I think you already know how it worked out. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at him, really looked, the way she used to catch things across the office before he'd noticed them himself, and something passed between them in the dark that neither was ready to name, and both, he understood, had known was there for a long time. Your sister wasn't wrong, he said. You were never the coward, you were the 10 minutes she bought still walking around, still breathing, still refusing to be spent. That's not a weapon. That's the bravest thing I've ever stood next to. He rose before she could answer, because he could see she had none, and because he had questions of his own that would not keep until morning. Sleep. I have to go and learn how the wolf got into my house. It was Anselm who brought the proof, an hour later, and Emmerich knew from the man's face at the door that it was going to take something from him. You had me pull the tower phone logs, Anselm said. Tuesday night. Every call out of the building between the time Verity locked her door and the time you found it kicked in. He set a single printed page on the table, and he would not meet Emmerich's eyes, and that told Emmerich the name before he read it. One call, boss, 9 minutes, to a number we've had flagged as a Kroll cutout for 2 years. His jaw worked. It came from the private line in your brother's office. The room went very quiet. On the laptop screen, Ambrose Kroll's stolen empire kept scrolling. Lucan, their father's easy grin, the captured pawn, turning over and over in his fingers. You ought to be opening the good bottle, M. Lucan, who had trailed him down to Verity's ruined office and read the 4 words over his shoulder and said she wouldn't. Would she? Planting the poison, steering him toward the bearable lie. Lucan. Drowning. Emmerich knew it now. Saw all of it at once the way you see the true shape of a thing, only after it's already cut you. Drowning in debts. He'd hidden behind that grin. Debts a man like Ambrose Kroll would be delighted to buy in exchange for one phone call. Emmerich did not shout. He did not sweep the table clear or put his fist through the wall. He stood perfectly still and felt the last warm thing in the old house of his heart go quietly and completely to ice. And when he spoke, his voice was so calm, it frightened even Anselm. He gave them the door, Emmerich said. My brother sold her to the man who killed our father to cover a card debt. He looked at Verity, who had turned in her chair, and was watching him with an expression that held no surprise at all, only a deep, tired grief on his behalf, because of course she had already known, or guessed. She always knew first. You tried to tell me in the chapel, the rot is in your house. You knew it was him. I suspected. Her voice was gentle, which was somehow worse. I hoped I was wrong. For your sake, I hoped I was wrong. He picked up the page with Lucan's name on it, folded it once, and slid it into his breast pocket. Over his heart, like a man filing away a debt he fully intended to pay. Then he crossed to the window and looked out at the freight yards and the black water beyond, and began, in the cold and total quiet of a man who has run out of rules, to plan, because now he knew all of it. He knew what Verity was, and what she carried, and what it could do. He knew Ambrose Kroll was moving his money in the dark, believing himself safe behind 20 years of a broken truce and one bought brother. And he knew, with the terrible clarity that had made him the most dangerous man on the North Bank, exactly how to end it. Anselm. Emmerich didn't turn from the glass. Send my brother a message. Tell him I found Verity, that she's hurt, that I don't yet know who gave her up, and that I want the whole family at the tower tomorrow night to decide our answer to Kroll. He watched a freight train crawl across the far dark, its lights a row of cold stars. Tell him I need him. Tell him I don't know what I'd do without him. Anselm hesitated. You're setting a trap for your own brother. I'm setting a table, Emmerich said softly, and inviting everyone who still thinks I'm following the rules. He turned at last, and the smile on his face did not reach his eyes, which had gone somewhere cold and final. Verity. Can that key of yours be ready to fire by tomorrow night? Prosecutors. Press. All of it. Ready to drop the second. I give the word. She was already typing. It can be ready in an hour. The key was never the question, Emery. She looked up at him, bruised and unbreakable in the lamplight. The question was always whether you'd be willing to burn your own house down to use it. My house, Emmerich said. Burn down the moment they laid a hand on you. Tomorrow we only settle who pays for the ashes. The Corvée Tower wore its lights like armor. 51 floors of glass burning gold against the black winter sky, the way it did on every night that mattered, so the whole city could see that the Corvée family did not hide. Emmerich stood at the head of the long council room and watched his people file in, the capos, the money men, the old soldiers who had bled for his father, and he greeted each of them by name, and he felt nothing, because he had spent the last 20 hours turning himself into the instrument this night required. Verity was not in the room. Verity was 2 floors down in the operations suite, in front of 3 monitors, with Dr. Locke at her elbow, and a loaded pistol she still didn't know how to fire taped within reach of her bandaged hand. She had refused, flatly, to be left at the safe house. You need me firing the key at the exact right second, and the right second is going to arrive, whether I'm ready or not, she'd said, and he had stopped arguing, because she was correct, and because he had learned at last that keeping Verity Cole out of the fight was a thing that could not be done, only survived. Lucan came in last. He wore grief like a well-cut coat, pale, shaken, the very picture of a brother frightened for a wounded friend. He gripped Emmerich's arm. Anselm told me. Is she, God, is she going to be all right? Do we know yet who gave her up? Not yet, Emmerich said, and let his brother see exactly the exhausted, uncertain man Lucan expected to find. But we will. Sit, we have a great deal to decide. He let the meeting run 11 minutes. He let his capos argue over Kroll and the dead treaty. Let them rage. Let Lucan perform his careful outrage. We have to hit back. We can't let them think us weak. Whatever you need, I'm with you. He let it build. And the whole time, a single cold clock ran behind his eyes, counting down to the thing he knew was coming, because he had arranged for it to come. At the 11th minute, Anselm's voice came quiet through the earpiece under Emmerich's collar. Cars, boss. 6 of them coming up the freight road with their lights off fast. A pause. Lead car's an armored Bentley. He came himself. Kroll's in the building. Emmerich set both hands flat on the table and let out a slow breath, and something almost like peace moved through him. His brother's phone call had done exactly what he'd built it to do. He looked down the long table at Lucan, at their father's grin, at the hands that had turned that pawn over and over, and he stopped pretending. 20 minutes ago, Emmerich said, to the whole room but to one man only, Ambrose Kroll drove onto the north bank with 6 cars, because someone he trusts told him that Verity and the key that can destroy him would both be in this tower tonight, wounded and undefended. Someone who has sat at this table his whole life. The room went still. Lucan's smile began, very slowly, to die. Someone who called a Kroll cutout from his private line on Tuesday night, 9 minutes. And told an old monster which door to kick in. Lucan started. I invited you here to help me plan our answer to the man who took her. Emmerich drew the folded page from his breast pocket and laid it on the table, his brother's name facing up. I lied. I invited you here so you could watch me give it. Then the lights went out, and the tower became a battlefield. Kroll's men came up the fire stairs and out of the service elevators, and for a few seconds the top floor was strobing muzzle flash and shattering glass and the flat hammering of gunfire in a closed space. But Emmerich had not spent 20 hours preparing to be ambushed. He had spent them preparing to be the ambush. The men Kroll sent up the stairs met Anselm and 8 Corvée soldiers waiting in the dark with the blueprints of their own building. The men who took the elevators opened the doors onto a killing box. Emmerich hauled Lucan down behind the overturned table by his collar. Not to shield him, to keep him. You don't understand. Lucan was gasping over the noise. The debts, it was millions. Kroll owned the paper. He swore no one would get hurt. He swore he only wanted the woman. I didn't know she mattered to you. I swear to God I didn't know. That's the part I can't forgive. Emmerich's voice was perfectly level, 6 inches from his brother's face, while the war went on above them. Not that you sold her, that you thought she didn't matter. That you looked at the person, holding my whole life together, and saw something small enough to trade. He pressed his own spare pistol into Lucan's shaking hands, and closed his brother's fingers around it. Stay down, stay alive. I'm not finished with you. Then he was up, and moving through the dark and the dying, toward the private stair, toward the 2 floors between him and Verity. Because the cold clock behind his eyes had never once stopped, and it was telling him that Ambrose Kroll had not come up to the council room at all. Kroll had gone down, toward the operations suite, toward the key. Emmerich took the stairs 4 at a time. He came through the operations suite door into a tableau lit only by the glow of 3 monitors. Dr. Spashen. Locke was on the floor against the far wall, one hand clamped hard to her own shoulder, teeth gritted against the pane, alive and furious. 2 of Kroll's men lay where Anselm's rear guard had dropped them. And in the center of the room, backlit by the screens, stood Ambrose Kroll, older than Emmerich remembered, silver and elegant in a camel coat, a pistol hanging easy at his side, as though he had never once in his life needed to hurry. He had Verity by the hair. He dragged her half out of her chair, and her bandaged hands were braced on his forearm, and her face was a mask of pain and pure, incandescent hate. There he is, Kroll said pleasantly, not turning. The boy who broke 20 years of peace over a bookkeeper. Your father would be so disappointed, Emmerich. He understood the rules. He gave Verity's hair a small, cruel twist. She, of all people, ought to have taught you to guard your pieces. I taught her myself. Didn't I, little bird? Everything you know, you learned at my table. Everything I know, Verity said through her teeth. I've been using to bury you for 5 years. You simply couldn't read it. Her eyes found Emmerich's across the room, and impossibly, in that grip, in that much pain, she winked at him with her good eye. Emmerich, ask him why he's holding my hair and not simply shooting me. Emmerich understood at once. Because he can't read his own empire without you, he said slowly, lowering his own gun a fraction, buying the second she was asking him to buy. Because the key's in your head, and a dead accountant decrypts nothing. He needs you breathing. I need her cooperative, Kroll corrected. There's a difference, and I'm very patient about closing it. He looked at Emmerich at last, and his eyes were the flat, tidy eyes of a man who had raised an orphan girl at his own table, and then murdered the last of her blood to keep his books tidy, and slept soundly ever after. Put the gun on the floor, and slide it to me, or I stop being patient with her, and you will not like how quickly I run out of patience. Emmerich looked at Verity. Verity looked at the monitors, then back at him and mouthed a single word. Now, Ambrose, Emmerich said, and let a small, cold smile touch his mouth. You spent 30 years hiding your empire so well that only one person alive could ever read it back to you. You should have lain awake all those years, wondering what would happen if she ever decided to read it out loud. Verity's bandaged fingers, hanging at her side where Kroll had forgotten them, closed on the wireless trigger. She'd been palming since the door opened. A single key, already primed, already loaded, aimed at every federal inbox and every newsroom server in 3 states. She pressed it. Nothing visible happened for a moment. And then, everywhere phones began to ring. The dead men's phones on the floor, Kroll's phone in his coat, the phones of the surviving soldiers upstairs, the gunfire above already stuttering into confusion as men stopped to stare at their screens. Somewhere out in the frozen city, in the space of 90 seconds, 30 years of Ambrose Kroll's hidden empire arrived, fully indexed, cross-referenced, impossible to bury, in the hands of every prosecutor and every reporter who had spent a career unable to lay a finger on him. Account numbers, judges, the invoices for the bodies, all of it at once, with her cipher stripped away and the plain, ugly truth left standing in the light. Kroll felt it happen. Emmerich watched him feel it, watched the elegant certainty drain out of the old man's face as his phone buzzed and buzzed and buzzed against his ribs, each pulse another account frozen, another owned man reading his own name in a warrant. Another loyal soldier realizing the ship had not merely sprung a leak, but had already gone down and taken all of them with it. "What did you do?" Kroll whispered. His grip on Verity's hair had gone slack. "I stopped being the girl you raised," Verity said, and pulled free of him. She stumbled, caught herself on the desk, and turned to face the man who had made her, and hunted her, standing on her own 2 feet, in a room full of the ruin of him. "And I became the thing that survived you. You should have left my sister alone, Ambrose. You should have left me buried, but you never could leave a loose end, could you? You always had to tidy up." It was in the end Lucan who proved her point. He had followed Emmerich down the stairs, to help, or to run, or to beg, Emmerich would never be certain which. And he stood now frozen in the doorway, and Ambrose Kroll, ruined and cornered and reaching by pure instinct for the one lever he had left, turned his pistol on the man who had sold him the door. "You!" Kroll snarled at Lucan. "You promised me she'd be alone. You promised me." Kroll. "No! I did everything you—" The shot was very loud in the small room. Lucan folded against the door frame with their father's grin gone from his face forever, and slid down it, and was still. He died at the feet of the brother he'd betrayed. Killed by the monster. He'd betrayed him, to tidied up. A loose end, in exactly the way Ambrose Kroll had always disposed of the people who served him. He had already grieved his brother the night before over a folded page. But something in him closed like a door, and when he raised his eyes to Ambrose Kroll, they held nothing human at all. Kroll swung the pistol toward Emmerich. Too slow. An old man out of time and out of empire. Emmerich shot it out of his hand. Then he crossed the room, and he did not hurry, because he had learned that from her, and he took the old man by the collar of his fine camel coat and put him on his knees in front of the monitors that were still, silently ending him. "You said I should guard my pieces." Emmerich's voice was almost gentle. "You were right, so let me introduce you properly to the one you underestimated." He turned Kroll's ruined face toward Verity, who stood swaying and battered and unbroken in the glow of her own handiwork. "This is the accountant. She isn't a bookkeeper, and she isn't a little bird, and she was never yours. She is the woman who just ended you. Look at her while you understand it." And Ambrose Kroll, stripped of 30 years, and every man he owned, looked. And then Emmerich Corvey finished the war his father had lost, quietly, and let the old monster fall among the wreckage of his own secrets. The gunfire above them had stopped. The tower was silent. And in the glow of 3 screens, across a floor full of consequences, Emmerich and Verity looked at each other and were, for the first time in 5 years, simply 2 people who had survived the same disaster and chosen each other in the middle of it. "You're bleeding again," he said. "So are you," she said. Neither of them moved to do anything about it for a long moment. The war did not end with a treaty. It ended with a flood. By dawn, Ambrose Kroll's name was on every front page, and every warrant a judge could sign before breakfast. The accounts Verity had unlocked froze one after another, like a river going to ice. The owned men, the bought judges, the enforcers, all of them woke to find their names printed in the plain light and their patron dead in a rival's tower. And they did what such men always do when the money stops. They scattered. They turned on one another. They called lawyers. The great Kroll organization that had bled the South Bank for 30 years did not fall to a Corvey gun in the end. It fell to a woman with cracked ribs and a cipher. And it fell so completely that within a week there was no one left across the river with the strength or the nerve to want a war. Emeric buried his brother quietly. In the family plot, beside their father. He paid for the stone himself and stood at the grave alone in the cold, and did not forgive him and did not pretend to, but he grieved. For the boy Lucan had been before the debts and the grin and the phone call. For the brother he might have had in some other life where the rules had held. Then he put it away, the way he put everything away, in a room inside himself with the door pulled shut. But he noticed, walking back to the car, that the room was no longer the whole house. Something else had moved into the rest of it while he wasn't looking. 5 years ago, one quiet cup of coffee at a time. He did not take Verity back to the tower. He took her home to the private house on the North Hills, that no one entered, where no business was ever done, the one place in his life he had kept for no one, because there had been no one to keep it for. He carried her over the threshold because her ribs would not let her manage the stairs, and she was too tired to make her usual dry remark about it. And that told him more about how near the chapel had come to killing her than all of Locke's careful diagnoses had. For the first 3 days, she mostly slept. Emeric Corvey, who had not cooked a meal for another living person in his adult life, learned. He learned badly, and then adequately. He learned which of Locke's pills went with food, and which on an empty stomach. He learned that Verity, unconscious or nearly so, still catalogued everything, that she would surface for 10 minutes, tell him something devastatingly precise about the state of his organization, or the correct way to hold the knife he was clumsily buttering toast with, and sink back under before he could answer. He sat in the chair beside her bed through the worst of the fever nights. The way she had, he now understood, sat outside his door, through 5 years of his own crises, present and unthanked and utterly reliable. And he thought about the arithmetic of that, and it shamed him, and he stayed. On the 4th day he came in with the tray, and found her sitting up on her own, pale but clear-eyed, the swelling around her eye finally going down, and she was holding, of all the things in that house she might have reached for, the small traveling chess set he kept on the shelf, the pieces laid out mid-game. "You still play like a man defending a fortress," she said without looking up. "Everything pulled back, everything protected, nothing risked. It's why you always lose to me." She moved a piece with 2 bandaged fingers. "You'd sooner keep every man safe on the back rank than send one out where it might not come home. It's a coward's board, Emeric. And you are not a coward, so I've never understood it." He set the tray down and sat across from her, and looked at the game she'd laid out, his king walled in, small, safe, useless, and felt the whole shape of the last 5 years rearrange itself in front of him. "I understood it fine," he said quietly. "I lost my father to this life when I was 23. I decided that day I'd never again put anything I couldn't afford to lose out where the world could take it." He reached out and very gently turned her wrist over, the one still wrapped in gauze, the raw marks beneath. "So I kept everything on the back rank, including you. I kept you right outside my door for 5 years and called it protection, when what I was really doing was refusing to admit what it would cost me to lose you. If I never moved the piece, I never had to know its value." His thumb moved once across the bandage, and then Kroll took it off the board for me, and I learned its value anyway. All at once, in a chapel that smelled like the river, Verity had gone very still. "I don't know how to not work for you," she said finally. Her voice was low, and under its steadiness he could hear the thing she'd carried since the chapel, since long before the chapel. "It's the only shape I know how to be. I found you, and I made myself useful, and I stayed useful every single day. Because the day I stopped being useful was the day you'd have no reason to keep me, and I couldn't." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "Being carried out of that room frightened me more than anything they did to me, Emeric. Do you understand that? Being helpless in front of you, being the thing you had to save, instead of the thing that saves you. I have spent my whole life making certain I was never ever the one who needed rescuing. I know." He did know. "Now, that's why you left me a map in your own shorthand while they dragged you out. Even taken, even bleeding, you had to be useful. You had to be the one who solved it. He shook his head slowly. Verity. You have to hear the thing I'm about to say, because I'm only going to know how to say it once, and I'm going to say it badly. She waited. She had always been able to wait better than anyone he'd ever known. You were never a piece I could afford to sacrifice. He lifted the white queen from the board, set it in her bandaged palm, and closed her fingers around it. That's the mistake I made for 5 years, and it's the mistake Kroll made, and the mistake Lucan made, and it killed 2 of them and very nearly killed you. Everyone in this city looked at the quiet woman outside the door and saw a pawn. Something small, something you spend to protect the pieces that matter. His voice roughened. You were never the pawn. You were the reason. The whole board still stood. You were the queen the entire time, and I was too much of a coward to move you out where everyone could see it, because if the world knew what you were worth, the world would come for you. He closed his own hand over hers, over the queen. It came for you anyway, so we're done hiding you on the back rank. From now on, you don't work outside my door. You sit at the table, my name and yours, on everything. Partners, equals. In the open, where anyone who wants to reach you has to come through the most dangerous man in Halden Bay to do it. And I have lately demonstrated, a ghost of dark humor, exactly how far I am willing to go about that. Verity looked down at the white queen in her broken hand for a long time. You cancelled a treaty for me, she said at last, very quietly, and it was not a question, it was a fact. She was finally, carefully allowing herself to hold. You broke a 20-year peace, and you burned your own house down, and you let your brother go to his grave for the woman who pours your coffee. I ended a bad peace, Emmerich corrected. I dismantled a traitor. Those are only business. He leaned in until there was nothing between them but the small board and 5 years of everything they had never said. I crossed the river for you. I broke every rule I own for you. I would have burned this entire frozen city to the waterline and salted the ashes before I let that chapel be the last place you ever were. Don't confuse the business, he said, with the reason. The pragmatic walls she had built, brick by brick, over a lifetime of being no one's to lose, did not come down all at once. She was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of story. But he watched them crack, and he watched her decide to let them, and it was the bravest thing he had ever seen a person do. Braver than the chapel, braver than the map, because it cost her the one defense she had never once lowered. She reached up with the hand that wasn't holding the queen, and rested her palm flat against the center of his chest, over the steady, ordinary miracle of his heart, and felt it beating there, alive, because she had kept it that way. Okay, she whispered. Okay, Emmerich. Her cracked mouth curved, the same almost smile she'd given him from the chair in the chapel, the one that had brought the coldest man in the city to his knees in the filth. Partners, equals. In the open, the familiar dry wit flickered back into her eyes. Unkillable, the thing he'd fallen for years before he'd let himself know it. But I'm still going to beat you at chess every Thursday. Partnership does not extend to the board. I have standards, he laughed. A real one, startled out of him the sound of a man who had forgotten he owned it, and pressed his forehead to hers, careful of the fading bruise, and stayed there. The house on the North Hills learned a new shape after that. She could not sit still. He'd known that about her for 5 years, but he learned it differently now, watching her try to reorganize his study from an armchair on the 6th day, because idleness frightened her more than any man ever had. So he made her a deal, 1 hour of work in the mornings, at the long table by the window, the oxblood notebook open and a pot of coffee between them, and in exchange she ate a full meal and let Locke change the dressings without arguing. She took the deal the way she took everything, reading the fine print first, then honoring it to the letter. In the mornings then, they ran his empire together across a kitchen table, her voice steadying a little more each day, his questions growing sharper as he learned to see the board the way she saw it. In the afternoons she slept, and he worked the phones, and the city slowly rearranged itself around the new arrangement without ever being told what the arrangement was. And every Thursday, without fail, she beat him at chess. He found he didn't mind losing nearly so much as he'd once believed. It turned out there were things worth a great deal more than never being taken. 6 weeks later, the snow had turned to gray slush in the gutters, and the men who had spent 30 years terrified of Ambrose Kroll came, hats in hand, to the Corvey Tower to ask Emmerich what peace would cost them. They came up to the 51st floor, 3 of them. The heads of what remained of the South Bank families, older men with careful eyes, who had survived the flood only by keeping their money somewhere Verity's cipher hadn't reached. They came expecting to bargain with a warlord. They found something they had no category for. Emmerich sat at the head of the table. Yes. But the chair at his right hand, the chair that had belonged for, as long as any of them could remember, to a Corvey capo or a Corvey gun, was filled by a small woman in a charcoal suit, dark hair pinned back, an oxblood notebook, squared precisely to the table's edge in front of her. She poured no one's coffee. She rose for no one. When the eldest of the 3, a silver-haired man named Osric Balin, who had buried 2 sons in the Long War, let his gaze slide over her with the automatic dismissal of 50 years' habit, he made the very mistake Ambrose Kroll had made, and Emmerich watched him make it with something almost like pity. "We'll speak with you, Corvey," Balin said. "Alone. This is family business. The girl can fetch us something hot while we—" "The girl," Emmerich said, and did not raise his voice, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees regardless. Unwound 30 years of Ambrose Kroll's empire in 90 seconds from a chair, with 3 broken ribs. "Everything you are frightened of tonight, she built the weapon for every account you are praying she doesn't have. Assume she has it. You are not sitting across from my secretary Balin. You are sitting across from the reason you are still breathing to insult her." He let that settle. "Her name is Verity Cole. She speaks for this family with my full voice. And if you'd care to test whether I mean that, you may address your next foolish sentence to her and find out." There was a long silence. Balin, who had not lived to silver hair by being unable to read a room once it was spelled out for him, turned his body, fully, deliberately, with the grave courtesy of an old man conceding he has misjudged the board, and inclined his head to Verity. "My apologies," he said, and meant it. "Mares. Cole, what does peace cost?" Verity opened the notebook. She did not gloat. She never had. She simply laid out the terms in her flat, exact voice. The shipping lanes, the tariffs, the lines that would not be crossed again, the names of the men who would be handed to the law, and the men who would be permitted to retire quietly, and Emmerich sat back and watched the most dangerous minds left on the South Bank slowly understand that they were not being conquered. They were being organized. That the woman with the notebook had already thought 3 moves past every objection they could raise, had already priced every betrayal they might be considering, had already, somehow, arranged matters so that staying loyal was the only arithmetic that came out in their favor. By the time the 3 of them left, subdued, intact, and more secure than they had been in 20 years, Balin paused at the door and looked back at her, and there was real respect in it. The grudging awe of an old predator for a thing more efficient than himself. "Kroll kept an accountant like you once, they say," he said. "Lost her, years back. Never recovered." "He should have taken better care of what he had," Verity agreed pleasantly, and did not look up from the notebook, and let the door close on him. When the room was empty, Emmerich poured 2 glasses of the good Scotch, the bottle that was for, after the ink dried, and set one in front of her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the tower's gold light burned out over both banks of the river now, over water that no longer marked the edge of anything he wasn't allowed to do. "You enjoyed that," she observed. "I enjoyed watching a man who called you the girl walk out, having agreed to every term you set." He turned his glass. "That's not the same thing. It's adjacent." She almost smiled. She reached across the table, and without asking, adjusted his king on the small board that lived there. Now the game between them, perpetual, ongoing and never quite finished. You buried your king on the back rank again. You're going to have to unlearn a lifetime of hiding. Americ, it'll take years. Good thing I have someone patient to teach me. He watched her hand withdraw, the faint marks at her wrist catching the light, and thought of the chapel, and the ropes, and the 4 words in a stranger's hand, she was always ours, and how completely, how expensively, how permanently he had made a liar of them. You know he was wrong, in the end, Kroll. The note, I know, she lifted her scotch. I was never his. She looked at him over the rim of the glass, and the dry steel in her eyes had something warmer behind it now, something she'd stopped bothering to hide. I chose where I belonged a long time ago. It only took the roof falling in for both of us to say it out loud. Emmerich Corvey looked at the woman who had hidden inside his life for 5 years, who had run his empire on 3 cracked ribs, ended his greatest enemy with a single keystroke, and corrected his chess in the same breath, and understood, fully and finally, that everything he had ever built, the whole ordered and armored and beautiful machine of his life, had only ever run because she was standing quietly at the center of the board, holding it all in place. He was never going to make the mistake of not seeing her again. Thursday, he said. Chess. My office. I'm going to beat you this time. No, Verity said, and this time she smiled, fully, the healed lip and all. You're not, but I'll let you set the board. Emeric Corvey broke every rule he had to cross a river for a woman. The whole world had mistaken for something small, and in doing it, he learned the most dangerous truth in his violent world. The quiet ones, the ones who stand just outside the door and hold everything together while no one watches. They're the queen, and the man wise enough to move her into the open, and strong enough to defend her there, doesn't merely win the game. He stops playing to survive, and finally begins to play, to live. That is how you break every rule and call it loyalty. That is how a mafia boss loses a treaty, a brother, and an empire's worth of illusions in a single night, and walks away richer than he has ever been, because for the first time he knows exactly which piece on the board he would burn the whole world to protect. If this story pulled you all the way to the end, the cold open, the chapel, the moment the key went live and 30 years of an empire came down in 90 seconds, then do the quiet one who wrote it a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more grounded mafia stories where the underestimated hold all the power. And share this with someone who needs reminding that the strongest person in the room is almost never the loudest. Tell me in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Emmerich would burn it all down for her? I'll see you in the next one.